So my name is Simone Murray, and I'm an associate professor of literary studies at Monash University. So I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, in the sort of inner southeast of Melbourne. I'm at least on Wiradjuri country, the people of the larger Kulin Nation in this part of Australia. And I must say, I've been hearing so many of the welcomes to countries at each session, and I felt that this conference is more kind of located in space than ever before. But ironically, because of Zoom, we're more dematerialized and free-floating than ever before. So it's been a vertiginous kind of experience. Can I ask all the participants on the call to mute their microphone during the presentation by our three fabulous speakers here today? And what we will be doing is having our presenters speak between 15 to 20 minutes. I'll give them a 3 minutes to go signal at 17 minutes and then ask them to wrap at 20. And we'll have question and answer for 10 minutes after each paper, so people can come and go between sessions if they like. Please feel free to cue your questions in the chat. This is interesting to other participants to see what they're making of it, and it also gives the speaker a little bit more time to formulate an answer rather than being put on the spot. So that will be fine to do if you care to. Okay, our three speakers on this interesting panel about textual industry are going to be Emmett Stimson, Natalie Connew, and Alexander Cothran. They're respectively from Deakin University, Victoria University, and Flinders University. So I'm going to ask our first speaker, Emmett Stimson, if he'd like to screen share. If he's using a PowerPoint, you can kick that off now. And the title of his talk, Difficult Literature, Self-Publishing and the Limits of Gatekeeping. Please take it away, Emmett.
Thank you very much. Yes, today I'm going to be talking about basically self-published highbrow literature. Now, most discussions of self-publishing tend to focus on writing in popular genres, and this is because notable works of self-published fiction like E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey, which at one point in Australia comprised one out of every 6 books sold at the height of its popularity, Andy Weir's The Martian, and others have become unlikely bestsellers. Media accounts frequently lionize these works by emphasizing that their success has not relied on traditional gatekeeping practices. In so doing, self-publishing becomes a populist practice associated with ordinary readers whose true preferences differed markedly from the good taste of publishing professionals and book reviewers. Nick Levy has argued for self-published novels as an example of what he's termed post-press literature. For him, post-press literature is created outside of the established circles of book production, and it has 3 characteristics. It is self-published, distributed digitally, and strongly associated with particular genres of fiction that are commercial. So again, this idea: self-publishing is genre-based, it's commercial, it's populist, right? But in point of fact, there have been a number of explicitly literary self-published works that have had unexpected levels of success. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about Sergio de la Pova's A Naked Singularity from 2008, which went on to win the Penn Prize for debut fiction in 2013 and has been adapted into a film in 2021 starring John Boyega from the most recent Star Wars trilogy. But there are many other works of this kind, like Evan Dara's The Easy Chain, which was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement and has been translated into Spanish. Aidan Jones Pearson's Cow Country, which was the subject of profiles in Harper's and the New Republic. And here in Australia, Nicholas John Turner's Hang 'Em When He Is Not There was self-published, but then has subsequently been republished by traditional publishers in the UK and the US and longlisted for a literary prize in the UK. And Moya Costello's Harriet Chandler also received coverage in Australian outlets like the Sydney Review of Books. And there are many others as well. This is just a partial list. But these works testify to the fact that literary self-publishing is a significant phenomenon that deserves more serious consideration than it's been given thus far. Okay. All right, so highbrow self-publishing. These books are not only literary, but in Bourdieu's terms. Now, Bourdieu is somewhat unfashionable at the moment, but I think still useful as a reference point. In Bourdieusian terms, these works are strongly attuned to the autonomous pole of literary production. That is to say, they are to varying degrees experimental, difficult, and highbrow in ways that place them within a broad, modern and postmodern tradition of the art novel. These highbrow literary works are not suited or do not seem suited to the inherently heteronymous space of self-publishing, where books are ranked and algorithmically recommended in terms of sales and readers' genre preference. But as John Froh has noted, high culture has become a component of large-scale industrial production that finds its place as a niche market among others in the world of mass production. As a result, highbrow literature and other goods are bound by the same market logic as more explicitly commercial work, even if these logics manifest in different ways within the literary field. So the question I want to look at today is, how are autonomous art novels not only surviving, but in some cases thriving in this seemingly inhospitable market? All right. Okay. So to think about that, I think it's worth briefly thinking about highbrow fiction in the previous era, which Dan Sinykin has called the era of the conglomerate era, the era of conglomerate publishing. It's worth, which kind of stretches from 1960 to sometime in the early 2000s. And this is when media conglomerates were dominating trade publishing. And the reality was that this was already not a great space for highbrow fiction. There are many notorious examples of this. David Markson's subsequently lauded Wittgenstein's Mistress was rejected 54 times before being published by Dalkey Archive Press. He actually kept a list of everyone who rejected it, which you can see online. Gilbert Sorrentino's Mulligan Stew was rejected so many times, over 30 times, I believe, that he ended up including fictitious rejection letters at the beginning of the novel after it was subsequently accepted by Grove Press. All right? But even that being said, many highbrow, difficult experimental authors were quite successful in the conglomerate era. So I'm thinking of writers like William Gaddis, who had all his novels published by large publishers with quite good advances, despite there being difficult and weird books. And really, the reality is that although Gaddis was able to do this with difficulty as well, famously, in the contemporary mode, the conglomerates are just not publishing books of this kind. Maybe you can think of one or two here, but they're just these books are now being published almost entirely by small presses where they're being published at all globally. There are just very few examples. I can think of one or two, but yeah, not many. Okay. So I think what's part of the thing that's happening here with self-publishing, just as commercial works position themselves against the good taste of gatekeeping, highbrow self-published works are also thinking about gatekeeping in a critical way. So for commercial works, the idea is that the gatekeepers are too elitist, they're too out of touch with normal readers, they can't recognize a bestseller when it crosses their desk. This, of course, ignores the reality that predicting a bestseller is, very, very hard to do. It's betting on a roulette wheel, basically. But for self-published highbrow works, traditional publishers' gatekeeping practices are also called into question, but in this case, from the opposite side, for being too commercial. So here I'll quote Sergio de la Pava, whose novel he claims was rejected by 88 different literary agents in Australia. In America. I don't even know if there are that many literary agents, but that's the claim. It's a nice round number, which makes me suspicious of it, 88. But he says, regarding the large publishers in New York, I don't detect the greatest concern with art. All right, that's his quote. So the criticism of traditional publishing's intermediary becomes crucial here as well. And I think it's important to realize that these self-published works are aimed at a different audience as well, which is a new class of digital literary intermediaries as well. All right. Here are three covers of Sergio's novel. He self-published it via Ex Libris in October 2008. That is pretty clearly the cover all the way on the left there, which could be a metal album from 1992, I reckon. There are a lot of references to Yngwie Malmsteen in the book, so I don't think that's totally out of place with the aesthetics. We can see much more professional design in the University of Chicago Press reissue from 2013, and then the very tasteful Hachette cover there as well, which to me is a little bit bland actually as well, but whatever, we'll set that aside. But you can see the professionalization that happens as the work is self-published and then republished. The novel itself is 689 pages in the original publication. It's clearly an encyclopedic postmodern work. It combines highly technical information about the legal system and theoretical physics with absurd and obsessive discussions of the honeymooners, and also includes a side plot about an elaborate heist. This, by the way, there is a reason why this was made into a feature film, which is there's a good kind of 180 pages of this novel that you could kind of cut out and turn into a tight kind of crime fiction plot. I haven't seen the movie yet. I've not heard great things about it, but you can see why it was adaptable. There is an engagement with genre fiction and commercial fiction in this novel that I think is quite interesting and something I'm thinking about more in other ways as well. It was rejected by, as I mentioned, 88 literary agents and self-published. The novel was sent out to potential reviewers by Sergio's wife, Susanna, who I always like to acknowledge here because I think without her tireless work, the book would not have gotten anything like the reception it would have. And it's important to note, I think there's a lot to analyze in that relationship as well, which is outside the bounds of this paper, but I just think interesting to think about. But what ended up happening is that the novel's self-published status actually became part of the buzz around the book, which is really interesting to think about. Recently, Beth Driscoll and Claire Squires have developed a theory of buzz in their book on the Frankfurt Book Fair, which I talk about in an extended version of this, but I won't have time to go into here. And it did create buzz, and the early reviews note this. So the first major review of the book occurred in 2009 for Open Letters Monthly by Steve Donahue. And his review begins by basically just attacking self-publishing. He says, any dedicated, open-minded reader should be losing sleep over outfits like Ex Libris. These organizations are the internet's era to so-called vanity presses. You pay them a lump sum, and then the book sinks like a stone into the endless gray muck pond filled with 2.1 million other such manuscripts, right? So not a very nice description of self-publishing. But he goes on to note there that A Naked Singularity was published, in this method, and it's a masterpiece. And he goes on to compare it to Thomas Pynchon and William Gaddis. And that's a recurrent feature of the reception with this book, is the comparison to already canonical authors. It's an old technique. A lot of people have noticed this in reception, but that is what happens with this book. The reviewers are saying, yes, it's self-published, but it's like these classics. Veronica Esposito picked up on this discussion on April 30th, 2009 on her blog, Conversational Reading. She ultimately hosted a group read of the novel as well subsequently, and had a very similar kind of thing where, she says, a couple weeks ago, I got a query from the publisher of A Naked Singularity, who appeared to be the wife of the book's author, Sergio de la Pova. At any rate, it's a self-published title, and I know what you're thinking because it was the same thing I thought. So there's a shared assumption of what everyone thinks about self-publishing here, and all of that. Interestingly, Esposito hasn't even read the title at this stage, but is in fact just going off the other review to say, oh, this could be a really interesting book. It's kind of going under the radar. So this is part of the way that buzz is transmitted. We get the buzz of the review, and then that review is starting to influence other influencers. Esposito is particularly influential among a kind of a circle of highbrow bloggers and online reviewers at this time. So we get the dismissal of self-publishing, but this kind of recommendation and this interest, this sort of frisson that comes with the self-published fact. Scott Bryan Wilson then reviews the novel for the Quarterly Conversation, another publication run by Esposito, and we get the same kinds of comparisons. It's one of those fantastic big Messies book like Darkenville's Cat or Infinite Jest or Women and Men. So, novels by Alexander Thoreau, David Foster Wallace, and Joseph McElroy. Though it's not really like any of those books or those writers. So that's, interesting. Garth Risk Hallberg, who went on to publish City on Fire, one of the few kind of highbrow novels that has been published by a conglomerate over the last decade, or arguably highbrow novels, I think, has also reviewed the book at the time it came out. And he's very explicit about how this circle of reception brought him to the novel, which I think is interesting to think about how these influences are influencing each other. He said, I came across a review of A Naked Singularity by Wilson at the Quarterly Conversation, who said it was one of the best and most original novels of the last decade. This sent me back to a piece by Donahue at Open Letters Monthly, which I vaguely remembered, and he called it a masterpiece. And he says, these raves got my attention because the Quarterly Conversation and Open Letters Monthly are venues I've written for that cover the kind of books I tend to like. So to me, it's nice because it's a very open discussion of the way that reviewers and influencers are being, influenced by their peers. So this early reception of the novel demonstrates a few things. In 2009, highbrow reviewers were perceived self-published works as not worthy of their attention in general. And despite being new or small, online journals and blogs were influential among other influencers, and thus were a key mode of highbrow literary networks, a key point in them. Recommendations from trusted sources or agents within these networks often added significant weight and symbolic value to a book that might seem to be just a vanity project, all right, as well. And the book's value is made intelligible through comparisons to established high status authors as well. So those are some of the crucial points there. Ultimately, a contributing editor at the Quarterly Conversation was also an editor at University of Chicago Press and picked the book up. They republished it in 2012. De La Pava went on to win the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for a debut novel in 2013. And A Naked Singularity was also shortlisted for the Folio Prize in 2014. His third novel, Lost Empress, was published in the US by Pantheon subsequently, and it was reviewed widely in the New Yorker and elsewhere. And Naked Singularity was then reissued by major publishers in the US and the UK, and then subsequently made into a feature film. So this is quite an unusual story for sort of a highbrow self-published novel. All right. There are other examples of this in softer ways. I'd love to talk about Nicholas John Turner's Hang 'Em When He Is Not There, which is a really interesting example from an Australian author, but I don't have time to go through that today. So I just want to talk a little bit about the subfield of highbrow self-publishing. The existence of this field demonstrates the persistence of high and low notions that Bourdieu theorizes, even within a highly digital and heteronymous literary field that doesn't have clear or explicit gatekeepers. I think one key difference from the Bourdieusian frame is that high and low no longer structure the field, but I think they're still operating in the field, and I think that's important to think about. But it also problematizes the historical polarization between the autonomous and heteronymous fields, because highbrow self-publishers are actually using the same kinds of populist arguments as the blockbuster self-publishers. There's actually a link between them rather than a simple opposition. What this suggests to me is not an opposition between high and low, but a shared rejection of the remnants of traditional conglomerate publishing, which occupies the space that is often called the middle brow. So, I think one way to think was that middle brow is now dominant within the kind of conglomerate publishing. And so we've got this kind of, but it's also under attack from this sort of populist flank of self-publishing and this kind of highbrow flank of experimental publishing, who both don't like the sort of the middle brow center where I think both the money accrues, but a lot of the status is now accruing to the middle brow through literary prizes and things like that. So I think it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's an interesting way to maybe think about how the field may be shifting and maybe operating in different ways than in the Bourdieusian model. But highbrow works, self-published works, also have a different endgame than, say, the commercial works, which can go on to be bestsellers and earn a lot of money. This is a niche form of publishing. It's a niche mode of symbolic recognition among a specific group of readers, largely male readers, has to be emphasized here. I do think that's important to note. Male readers, critics, and influencers. And there's the possibility of republication by a larger publisher as well. And that's in some ways, that's weirdly, these works are opposed to this kind of conglomerate traditional publishing, but in a way, sort of the best case scenario is that they end up getting picked up by one of those very publishers and then go on to have the success from it. So that ends my talk today. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emmett. I was so busy writing notes at the end that I had to reach for the unmute button. Let's have a look in the chat. Now, that's Kate talking from earlier. Would anyone like to raise their digital hand? You already are. Ika, your first cap off the rank.
Awesome. How exciting. Thank you, everyone, and particularly Emmett for such an exciting first paper. A comment and then a question. The comment is about I love this idea of the shared rejection of the middle brow, but of course this, as I'm sure you know, this goes all the way back to Virginia Woolf at least. Like, the high brow is good and the low brow is kind of healthy and strong. Yep. And it's this kind of etiolated space of the middle brow that we all hate. So I wonder if want to comment on that. And the question also is around, are there fanish logics at work here? Because one of the things that's very interesting to me is how Joyce, for example, Joyce studies have always been kind of carried by an amateur engagement outside of the academy and outside of some of those certainly scholarly gatekeeping of not traditional publishing. We might think of Tolkien as well, which is a place where you have a lot of intense, both academic and fanish engagement. So is there something interesting to think about the ways in which these fanish logics work at both the high and the low levels outside of the middle brow?
Those are both fantastic points. Look, I completely agree that the rejection of the middle brow is by the highbrow is not new. Yeah. So, and I don't think it's new. I think in some ways, I think we're seeing a return. One of the weirdnesses about new digital moments in publishing is we're actually seeing a return to older logics in all kinds of ways. And of course, with Virginia Woolf and with the that coterie, there's lots of self-publishing going on, lots of things that look very much like self-publishing or vanity publishing in the current form. And you can even look at Hogarth Press in terms of who they published and how they published and all of that. So I think that's just absolutely true and a great point, and I don't disagree with it, basically. As to the second one, yes, I think there is, however, not in 2008, 2009 when this is happening, because we're still in a kind of a Web 2.0, in its kind of canonical form mode there. Most of the people who were at that point involved in the book's reception were attached to the industry in some way. So they were kind of agents in the field. I'm doing some other research now, looking at highbrow YouTube in particular, which I'm very interested in, and that to me is where the fanish logics really come in, and I think that's happening now in a really intense way, and kind of from 2018 onwards, you really start to see that with book Twitter, booktube, this kind of stuff. It's happening, but in 2008, 2009, not really, I think.
Great, we have many questions queued up, so let's go to David Wright now for his question.
Hi, thanks very much. This is a really topic that really appeals to me. I'm reminded of the DeLillo to Jonathan Franzen said, if the social novel lives but only barely surviving in the cracks and ruts of the culture, maybe it'll be taken more seriously as an endangered spectacle, a reduced context, but a more intense one. I create what's called electronic literature, or what's sometimes called digital literature, which are works that depend on programming or computer to exist. To put very simply, you can't print them. And there's quite established field here. There's a work, for example, one of the most successful works recently was Mira Hanafi's A Dictionary of the Revolution, which is this sort of interactive, very difficult piece, but very, interactive piece. And these are self-funded. They put them up online, disseminate them for free, basically, and essentially are self-published, but they're also funded by grants. And I personally have had this exact experience. I wrote a difficult novel. It was a bridesmaid, but never a bride, a number of competitions. I was asked by publishers and they said, it's too difficult. They literally said it's too difficult. And one even said in a competition, this was the most compelling entry we had, but our readers are more general kind of thing. So I created digital functionality. I put it up on free, and it won a Queensland Literary Award, about $15,000. The other one has got a $1,000 Arts Council grant. And these works, I've written a bit on this idea of, there's a theorist called Jessica Pressman who talks about digital modernism. And I wonder if this kind of area is perhaps where, is this space, this digitally disseminated or created space, is this where the social novel perhaps lives, or the difficult novel lives, barely surviving, but perhaps taken more seriously as an endangered spectacle, a reduced context, but a more intense one? Nevertheless, I still feel, there are still gatekeepers. Clearly, there's the prize committees, there's the grant committees, and these kind of things. So, yeah.
Look, I think it's a complicated question. I think a couple things to say. So I'm familiar, particularly with the hypertext novel, which often has been very difficult, and with that particular trajectory out of it. I think what's going on with these novels. So one thing I didn't mention is that all of the books that I talked about actually were available as print objects only initially, and that's an interesting facet. And I think that all of the writers involved here are print culture fetishists in a certain way. Like they're very attached to the traditional book industry. So their engagements with the digital, I think, are much more complex than the kinds of works you're talking about, which are often very open to the possibilities of the digital. So in a way, I see them as running parallel, but is very different phenomena that I think, look, it would be very interesting to explore those connections, but I do think that they're quite different phenomena at this stage. I think here I'm looking at authors who are all authors who want to be part of the traditional book industry, but feel in some way that they can't be, right? So I think
there's a term by Jessica Pressman called bookishness, which is
yes.
that we're now in the fetishization of the book. Yes. And what's interesting about some of these digital books is they've actually created print iterations of these otherwise born digital books. So it's kind of gone in the reverse way, which is interesting. But yeah, I won't take up any more.
No, that's fascinating. I think it's a great question and a great thing to think about. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
We've got a bit under 5 minutes for more questions. Can I ask Alex and the other people queued up for questions to be as succinct as you can, and that will maximize the amount of questions we can get through. Alex?
Yeah, sure. Very quick one. I'm just curious, when novels like these highbrow novels have success, is there any sign, Emmett, that the publishers are kind of scurrying around saying, oh, maybe we need to find more of these? Or do they just kind of say, well, that was a fluke, we won't bother looking again?
Look, I think where you're seeing that more is with things like Duck's Newburyport, or I'm a McBride's novels, or Milkman. So books that have gone on to win basically literary awards, largely produced by women. Interesting to note, I think, as well. And I think that's where you're seeing some of these books break through to have kind of actual commercial success. As to whether or not large publishers will pick those up as a trend, I haven't seen it yet, but it could happen. Be great if they did open their lists. I think there are a lot of reasons for this. Also it's hard to generalize about especially overseas conglomerates in the US and the UK, because they do produce so many titles. But I don't see much likelihood of the mid-list returning, which is where these novelists kind of lived in the past. So maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question, but there may be time after the third paper for more questions that call on all the other papers. Naomi Milthorpe.
Thank you. Thanks, Emmett, for a great paper. I was interested by your use of the term influencers, because it's it's kind of a gendered term now, and I guess related also to social media. So I was interested to hear more about the way that social media works, and maybe the kind of gendered ways that these influencers or gatekeepers are using social media.
Yeah, look, it's a really fascinating question, and it's a question that has changed. One of the things that interests me as I've been doing this research, and I focused on Esposito in particular, is there's a rise, to me, in the digital space. There's a rise of new kinds of figures who are somewhere, I think they are influencers in a kind of a technical sense, where they do some book reviewing, but the book reviews are often about kind of discovering books that maybe further their own profile in a sort of way. They do lots of buzzy stuff about, hey, you may be interested in these kinds of books, and they're doing a lot of soft buzz basically for other books. So, it is a fraught term, and it's one I think I actually need to think about as I continue with this. But I do think the logic of the influencer is moving into this space, and I think it becomes very clear in the kind of YouTube stuff that I've been looking at a bit. It is, this kind of fiction tends to be really, really just slated towards men. In particular, it's like prog rock concerts or something. I don't know. Like it's a very kind of masculinized space in all kinds of ways. It's very gendered male, and I think that has all kinds of effects on the way that it exists as it exists. It is not wholly male, and it is not purely male, and it's less male than it used to be. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I also think, as I mentioned, there are a lot of really prominent experimental female authors. And I think even amongst the men who do this, there's a recognition that they need to be reading female authors and they need to be talking about female authors in a way that there wasn't 10 years ago. So in 2008, 2009, I think you saw none of it. But I think now there's at least a recognition that, okay, yeah, sure, we can talk about Sergio de la Pova, but we've got to talk about Helen DeWitt, and we've got to talk about Lucy Ellmann as well. And we've got to make sure that, you know, they're being discussed. So yeah, look, I don't know if that's a very comprehensive answer to your question, but I think gender is really operating here in ways that I haven't yet fully theorized. But yeah.
Okay, it's great that they've woken up to the existence of female writers in the avant-garde New York space. What good news. Okay, it's time for us to turn to the second. Wow, exceptional. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Lots of virtual applause appearing, and I'm not surprised. Do people want to respond, ask questions, make comments? Just raise your hand virtually if you would like to. I might kick off while people are gathering their thoughts or getting their typing ready. Natalie, yeah, that was terrific.
Thank you.
I was thinking about Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet and the way that dialect features in those books and in some of her other books too that have been published since, like The Lying Life of Adults. And what you said about learning a formal language for social mobility being absolutely important to working class families, and yet the mother tongue erupting in moments of anger and frustration or self-defense on the streets of Naples. And Italian is one of your languages too, as you tell us. So I wondered if you had read her work or thought about it or found an affinity with it.
Oh, definitely. And so Italian is one of the languages I speak, but it's also Italian and Sicilian because my family can never be clear on identity. So my Italian family comes from Sicily. So I grew up with my nonna speaking Sicilian, which is not well thought of by the Italian mainland either. And I know Naples has its own issues with dialects like Sicilians do. And I have had the experience of traveling around the world with my cousins in Italy. I was with my cousins in Italy who live in Italy and are completely fluent, and being harassed by someone on the street and in just complete anger turned around and said something in perfect Italian. And my cousin looked at me and said, "But you can't speak Italian. You just said that perfectly." And so there's something really interesting about the way in which language is tied to emotion that I really want to think about, but I haven't done that thinking yet. But yeah, it certainly comes from my own experiences, and yeah, it's so incredibly familiar to me.
We have a question from Ika Willis. Ika?
Hi, me again. Thank you, Natalie. That was an astonishing piece, and it must have been challenging to share in this strange everyone in little boxes thing. So thank you for doing that. A comment and a question again. I was really struck by what you just said, in fact, about those sort of almost different parts of you that are associated with different languages. And there's a psychoanalyst called Philip Bromberg who's written a book called Standing in the Spaces Between, which is about, he has a theory of primary dissociation. He thinks that we're all a lot of people, and we kind of manage our multiple selves better or worse in different situations. And I wonder whether that might be a kind of theoretical framework that was useful to you in thinking through how these parts of yourself kind of coordinate.
Yes, thank you. I was frantically writing that down.
I can drop you an email later.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I think so. And that, look, the other part of the essay does deal with multiplicity, because I am troubled by what I'm seeing in the culture around us, and particularly coming from people like myself, other people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, to kind of form a block or a singular identity. And for me, that singular identity is not only unhelpful, but it's not authentic. It's not my experience. I don't think it's the experience of most of the most of the world, the global majority. And so I'm perplexed from it coming from within the house, you know, that idea that the call is all the more unsettling when it comes from inside the house. And so I'm really trying to think more broadly about the great power in multiplicity, because I think we tend to look at it through a colonized lens still, even as academics from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It's our default because it's the academy.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I think it might answer my other question, which was to say I think it is so important to think in these kind of multiple ways and to resist that kind of call to singularity. But what do you think might change if we start thinking in this way?
You mean for how we think of identity, or?
I guess, I mean, because I teach literature, one of the things I immediately think is we'll stop having nationally based literature classes, or maybe we would read differently, or maybe the world would just be a better place. But do you have a sense of what possibilities are opened up by shifting this basis of our thinking in this really fundamental way?
I mean, I'm struck by things I've heard on both the first and second day of this conference. And I can see Jahen is in the audience, and she gave a phenomenal paper. So Jahen Kebsi, I really encourage all of you to look for her work, because she gave a great paper about this and about how we teach literatures and literatures from different countries. She was talking about illiterature and refugee writing. And so her work, you know, I feel like she's got the answers that we are all going to hopefully be working towards. So she's a lot further along in her thinking. But also for us in the academy, I think it might have been you, Simone, who mentioned that, you know, teaching English in the academy was a way of making us all English. You know, when we bring it into curriculum and we bring it into schools, and when it was, you know, we were taught English literature, and it is a way of anglicizing us. So I think resisting that is also a form of, you know, I think a really authentic form of decolonization. So, I mean, I would love to see us all embrace it in those ways.
I have to confess, I think it was Larissa McLean-Davis,
okay.
but yeah, the point absolutely stands. I see that Miriam Lowe also had a question or a comment to contribute.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you for your paper. It was really interesting to hear about your personal trajectory and context. And as someone else who has a very complex background, I identified with so much of what you talked about. And I want to make a comment on embracing complexity and moving into both and rather than either or. I think is a really helpful approach, both personally and in pedagogy. So just wanted to make a comment, really.
Thank you. It means so much when I've had comments from I sent it to all my cousins, our massive, as you can imagine, there's, you know, 60 of us on our massive Facebook feed message thing. And they're not readers, you know, they're mostly, I come from a family of engineers and mathematicians, and they read it and it really resonated. And so for me, that's been really important to give voice to experiences that I think we don't tend to hear about in mainstream literary circles, you know.
Natalie, could you remind us which issue of, I'm guessing it's the Griffith Review, that this piece will be coming out in?
I think it will be in November, the exit routes. So I'm thinking about exit routes from the way in which we are thinking about identity at the moment.
That's terrific. And I've asked Ika if she could put the psychoanalysis reference in the chat for other people who might benefit from it. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, this is a good time to move to our third speaker in the session. This is Alex Cothran, and he's from Flinders University. Alex, if you'd like to start screen sharing, I'll just introduce the title of your paper, Australian Fiction on the Value of Art and Culture. So please start when thank you. We're back to recording, everyone, just for your information. Alex, please start when you're ready.
No worries. Well, hello, everyone, from a very cold and locked down Adelaide, kind of like the waters of the Murray River. We're finally getting our chance. The eastern states have finally shared their lockdowns, and you guys can keep it. You can keep this one. But yeah, I hope you are all safe and well, and hopefully, in proximity with someone to hug when you need to. Of course, that means I am also talking to you from the country of the Kaurna people, the Adelaide Plains, and I wish to pay respect to elders past and present, and to recognise that the relationship to this never ceded land is of continuing importance today. And a big quick thank you to Simone and all the organisers of the conference. I imagine it can't be difficult to organise these things in cyberspace, but I also imagine you're probably getting much better at it than you were this time a couple of years ago. So this paper today is taken from Paper in Progress. It's kind of the first sharing of this kind of new idea. And I'm going to be analysing two works of Australian fiction by Wayne Macaulay and Julie Coe, to see what they have to say about the way art is valued or perhaps devalued in this country. Cool. So the inspiration to analyse the text in this way actually comes from a Joe Cost article from way back in 2003, in which she talks about, because the arts sector needs funding to kind of survive, when it goes to the government, it started to really focus on the economic benefits of the arts to Australia. And while she totally understands this, the reason for doing this, she understands the speaking the language of the hand that feeds you, so to speak. She worries that it's by doing so, by over focusing on the economic benefits, we may be kind of hollowing out our understanding of the full value of the arts and what they bring to society. And that it may, in the end, actually affect the quality of work coming out of the country. So what she thinks, to help make sure that we are not kind of devaluing our own value of art, so to speak, she says that some of the communication about what art does and art policy itself needs to be done in the language and imagery of art. And there needs to be a reframing of the debate, so that art is not just about filling hotel rooms and such, but is actually emphasizing the fact that it is of central importance to human beings across the world. And as I said, this article is quite old, so it's 2 decades old. And in that time, there have been plenty of other writers and academics that have shared similar concerns, way too many to even fill the screen at the bottom, way too many to go over in this sort of short time. But the general argument can kind of be summarized as, because these sort of subsidiary benefits of the arts, things like health, education, economic impact as well, because they are A, probably easier to argue for at budget time, and B, perhaps easier to measure, although that itself is kind of up for debate, they end up becoming the center of the conversation. And we end up evaluating art based on things that have nothing really to do with the process of creating it or the experience of, being in front of it. And this is a big concern. So we end up kind of hollowing out our own conception of art as we're trying to make the argument for it. Of course, so these are very complex theoretical arguments sometimes around complex topics like culture and value. But if you go beyond the academic sort of literature review, you don't even need it really to see why we should be a little bit dubious about always relying on instrumental and economic arguments for the arts. And that is simply because it hasn't worked. So over the decades that this has been tried, more money has not come into the arts sector. It's dwindling away. The Arts Council budget is continually sliced and sliced and sliced. And when COVID hit, we were one of the slowest and I think one of the weakest countries in reacting to the struggling arts sector. So it just hasn't worked. So the question here is, okay, A, these concerns have not been assuaged, these concerns are still going. Academics are discussing them, but what about the call that Joe Cast had about talking about these issues in the language of the arts, in the imagery of the arts? As far as I can tell, this has pretty much gone unheeded, or at least it hasn't appeared in the academic literature in the field. So for example, in the kind of 200 articles that cite Joe Cast's article, there's a handful that include interviews, firsthand data gathering from artists about what they think about these issues. But there are none that actually analyze artistic works themselves to see what they say about this situation in Australia. So the paper today is obviously trying to fill that gap a little bit. So I'll be looking at Wayne Macaulay's 2007 novel Caravan Story and Julie Coe's 2016 story Inquiry Regarding the Recent Going On in the Woods. Published about a decade apart, but very similar stories. They're both quite surreal. They're satiric, both writers are known as satirists. And they both share this kind of attack on these contemporary valuation and reporting processes that turn artistic works into measurable outputs. They both have very startling, sometimes very violent imagery to try and get across the sense of how failing to meet these expectations of policymakers in terms of instrumental or economic impact can start to really erode an artist's belief in their work and also of themselves as well. They're both very dark stories. If anyone knows these writers' works, they tend to write in a very dark tone anyways. They're very dark stories, but they both end on images of hope. And I think that's really interesting because it suggests that is the part that asserts the centrality of art to our lives by showing it is resilient and it will outlast any sort of bureaucratic attack on it. And the things I talk about connect quite closely to some of the academic literature in the field, but they're also unique because of the fact that these are actual artistic works at the same time. So Caravan Story opens with this wonderful image of these two artists lying in bed while a government contractor bulldozes their house, which is about as perfect a metaphor as I've ever seen for finding out you didn't get the funding, right? You missed out on the latest funding round. And I'm sure even non-artist academics can kind of vibe with that as well. So the main character, who is a writer very unsubtly named Wayne, and his unnamed actor girlfriend are taken out of their demolished house, they're put in a caravan and they're shipped off to this abandoned footy field where they and a whole bunch of other artists that have been shipped off in the same way are expected to try and figure out some way that they can make an economic contribution. They're all stuck together. They have these administrators there saying, all right, we're going to figure out a way that you're going to help the economy. How are you going to do it? And for some of them, it's pretty easy. So for example, the painters start painting silos, and oh, great, now more people are going to come to the town and buy meat pies or whatever. So for some of them, it happens. For the writers, though, they can't really figure out any way to commodify their work, their artistic work. And then Wayne finds out that there's actually rejection slips being pre-written for the works that the writers haven't submitted yet. And when he finds this out, one of the administrators admits to him there's actually a plot in progress to kind of disillusion the writers and just get them away from their practice and turn them into something what this administrator describes as citizens that actually make a worthwhile contribution to society. And I read this novel quite a while ago, but when I'm rereading it for this paper, I was immediately reminded of this ad from the UK, Fatima the Ballerina ad. It came out, it was originally from 2019, but it resurfaced in 2020 during COVID. And it caused this huge backlash on social media, I think because many artists had kind of had similar experiences of kind of being told, oh, you're going to get a real job. And in this ad, there's this condescending voice saying, don't worry, this ballerina, she's having some fun now, but eventually we'll ship her off to something that's actually productive, which obviously really connects kind of what Wayne is exploring as well. So it's a real world example. And I think kind of further proof that for satirists, it's just harder and harder to overtake real life. Okay. So for some of the writers, there's just too many of them for the administrators to deal with, and it's intimated that they're actually just shipped off to a mass grave. They're killed, and just there's this final solution for the writers. And only a few of them are deemed worthy to have a second chance of trying to produce something that can be economically productive. So for one of them, Wayne gets this chance to try and write these kind of really formulaic, I guess lowbrow, going by Emmett's description, formulaic populist screenplays. And this, exactly as Joe Kauf's warns in an article, this quickly distorts his artistic practice because he obviously wants to please these policymakers. So he tries to learn his lessons, and all of his experimentation, all of his sort of instinctive artistic ideas, they just disappear. And again, this is exactly what Joe Kauf warns about in an article, saying if, it's well and good to point to some of the economic benefits, but if that becomes the language through which we talk about art, that's going to affect artistic practice. And experimentation is not something generally the market likes. Okay, again, going back kind of to Emmett's talk earlier about highbrow experimental literature, not something the market likes. And if artists are thinking about that too much, the very notion of the experiment, which is crucial to art in general, could be defeated. So again, you can see the way this literature connects to sort of the academic area. And the irony is that even though Wayne tries to turn out these screenplays, they still don't make money. And failing at this game starts to have this effect on his own personal value of himself, but then also the artistic community. He stops seeing himself as part of the community and as part of a plague. I mean, in this one scene, he basically breaks down and just begs to be anything but an artist. Is it too late to change? He says, can I be someone else? This isn't working. And this breakdown actually ends up kind of being the hopeful turn in the story, because in the very next sentence, even though he says, I don't want to be a writer anymore, sentences just keep coming through his head, story ideas keep coming through his head. And even once he learns that the stories that he's submitting are literally being thrown in the bin the next second, he just keeps writing anyways, which suggests that the process of creating art is itself something valuable that is divorced from whether it's a successful output or not. So Wei and his girlfriend end up escaping the community, and they go back to their house, and they kind of make this vow to one another that, you know, they're going to rediscover their personal and artistic identity. Whether or not that is a happy ending is kind of hard to say. The house is still half demolished. I don't know how they're going to make money, right? So they're still in a very precarious place, but at least suggests that even in the face of this kind of bureaucratic attack, they haven't lost their artistic identity. Art has been resilient. It still flows through them. So Julie Coe's inquiry regarding the recent going-ons in the woods, it shares this attack on how narrow-minded policy can start to affect artistic practice and the way that we value the arts in this country. A major difference here, though, is that in Caravan Story, this is a first-person story. It's told through the perspective of the artist trying to navigate these sort of bureaucratic waters. But Julie Coe's story is itself actually written in this bureaucratic language. So it's written as like a government report with headings, you know, recommendations, you know, that sort of thing. And it details this village council's extermination of this, what's called a guerrilla orchestra that live out in the woods. And a quick warning before I go into this, as I said earlier, there is some violent imagery described. Coe's story is very dark. It has moments of suicide and torture. And I will kind of briefly touch on those because it is really important to kind of her key idea of showing the artist under siege. So just a quick warning there for anyone. So just like the poor writers that end up in the mass grave in Caravan Story, the government in this Julie Coe story decides that they need to destroy these musicians simply because they're not part of the productive economy. They're out there in the weird woods. And as far as they can figure out, that's not the role of the woods, is to house members of the society who are not making money. So we need to destroy them. They're not fitting our definition of productive. And again, like the writers, part of the reason that they're not succeeding is because they're not creating popular things. So the report says, well, you know, these are the things that the villagers like. The villagers like tractors and they like beer. Why aren't you doing those things? You're making these weird foreign French horn sounds. And, you know, that's not productive. That's not going to sell anything. So, you know, you're gone. And what a great t-shirt, by the way. I mean, that's a t-shirt or anything, but there you go. And again, like some of the characters in Caravan Story, the artists begin to doubt their own self-worth in this kind of the face of this bureaucratic devaluation. One of the bassoonists gives himself up. He leaves the group, and they quickly put him in blankets and they put him in a suit and tie and they turn him into an accountant, right? Like exactly like Fatima, the ballerina again. You're like, don't worry, you know, you've had your art for a while, but here we are. We're going to turn you into something that's actually productive. So again, the connection between both these stories and kind of the real world situation is quite apparent. Gradually, the members that decide to continue to be artists are hunted down one by one. They end up in the end, there's this final confrontation between the government and this one, you know, remaining artist, and he's described very stereotypically with this, you know, open shirt and gold medallion. And one of the things I haven't really talked about in this particular talk because there's not that much time, but one thing I do like about these works is they are also making fun of artists at the same time. So they can sometimes attack some of the stereotypes about artists. And this is an example of that. But the way this character is described is you kind of think, okay, I think this guy's going to escape, right? He's very, you know, assertive about his personal identity. And so I think he's going to escape, kind of like Wayne from Caravan Story. But sadly, it's not to be. So there's this really horrific and powerful scene in the story, which up to this point has kind of been a little bit light and kind of funny, but it stops being funny. And so you get this scene where one by one, there's this torture scene where they destroy first this violence instrument, and then the very kind of physical objects that he uses, part of his own body, to make this music. So they break the violin, they cut off his ears, take out the voice box, sever his arms, crush his legs, and then finally he is killed by his own instrument. They string him up by the neck with his violin strings. So unlike Caravan Story, no artists do escape in this village. They are completely wiped out. And it is only at this moment, when art has completely disappeared from the village, that people start to realize, oh dear, that actually was something that was important to our lives. They have to destroy it before they realize its importance. So straight after killing this violinist, one of the community members realizes they've made a horrible mistake and actually kills himself. And the person who's writing the report describes they have to leave the woods immediately because the very silence of the woods, which up until then had music, is so disturbing that they can't listen to it. It's a really chilling image that I think kind of makes us re-see this sometimes a little bit cliche meme that goes around the internet saying, can you imagine a world without arts? And I think Julie Coe kind of takes on that idea and does it in a really interesting way. So not only the government, but also the villagers themselves, the populace have a change of heart. And, before they were bloodthirsty, but now they're like, oh, this poor violinist, he deserves a funeral. But of course, the irony here is that the villagers have this instinctive assumption, this cultural assumption that at a funeral you play music. This is what we do. This is what humans do. Unfortunately, they've destroyed all the musicians and all the instruments, so they can't have music at this funeral. And it says that, the government themselves, they don't know how to sing, right? I wouldn't want to hear Scott Morrison sing a Hillsong. It's kind of the same thing here, right? So no, they can't do music. While music was happening, they didn't value it, but as soon as it disappears, they realize this is something central in our lives, and now we're going to miss it. And so what happens is the villagers themselves actually turn on the government. And then in this kind of M. Night Shyamalan twist, we find out that the report itself is actually being written by the villagers, and it's a report that's trying to figure out how the heck did this extermination happen in the first place? What's wrong with our government that they did this? And it's also revealed that this is not the first time this has happened, that actually the woods themselves were painted by this group of artists who were then themselves exterminated. Everyone's forgotten about this until they kind of remember it. And so these villagers are stuck in this circle where they kind of forget about the value of art to their lives, they devalue it, they get rid of it, and then when it's too late, they kind of remember, oh gosh, this is actually something that we need in our lives. So they're stuck in this circle. So Coe's story is very dark, probably darker even than Wayne's, but it does also end on a moment of hope. This testimonial is showing that there's someone has seen in the woods this ink horse galloping around and this bass drum, suggesting that even when you raise art to the ground, it's still there in the soil. It's going to come back up. And whether or not the villagers learn this time to value or not is a different question, but it ends on this message of hope. And I mean, again, rereading these stories in kind of the last few years and the kind of continuing government indifference to the arts, my first instinct was these final images of hope are kind of like a flinch. They almost feel like a cliche happy ending. But I think that hope is actually earned when you consider the fact that these stories are happening in books that actually made it out into the world, right? These writers actually published their work, they did what they wanted to do. And so that I think is really important because these stories are not just about the resilience of the arts, they are actually themselves documents of art's resilience. And both of the writers have talked in interviews about the struggles of being an artist, being an Australian writer. Julie Coe in particular is very funny. It's not a particularly funny quote, but she's very sardonic and sarcastic. She talks about, being in a barbecue and someone saying, what do you do? She says that and their face drops and goes, get a proper job, right? So they, these struggles are real for the artists, but they've come through them. They've created art. And that is also what I think makes this type of evidence, this artistic evidence for the value of art, unique. Definitely unique from silly statistical graphs trying to, capture value, but also unique from the academic literature in the area, including, I guess, this presentation. The steel co's metaphor, the best we as academics can do is really accurately describe the woods, right? The value of the woods. But this type of evidence actually does that while painting the woods themselves into existence. So it's something that I'm really excited about continuing to explore. If anyone in the audience, if your brains have go, oh, that reminds me of another story, please send them through to me. I'm trying to find a bigger kind of a corpus to work with. So yes, please either email me, say it in the comments now, or send it to me on Twitter. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks very much. Could you maybe end the screen share just because it lets me see everyone in a larger view? Okay. While Alex was speaking, I was reminded very much of a cartoon on Bourdieu's Capital that I just posted in the chat, which you might find useful for teaching or giggling over at some future point. We have questions here already. David.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. Many sort of writers, artists in Australia and worldwide have sort of survived by attaching themselves to the academy and having a kind of academic career as well as, one informs the other, which, has emerged with these kind of creative writing and, film schools and whatnot. But there's also, if we look back historically, we see people like Helena Cizou and Maurice Blanchot, who were sort of academics first and foremost, but also produced really experimental writing. Do you think that kind of a career for an artist is a liberation or a restriction? Because academia obviously.
Sorry, I missed the end of your question there. You got muted, David.
Oh, sorry.
What was it? Yeah.
So do you think that sort of the scholar artist, functioning, do you think that resolves this problem, or do you think it's a liberation for them, or is it a restriction on them? Because, obviously academia has its own problems to this sort of funding predicament you're posing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to say, when you said, using kind of academia as kind of something to hang on to for an artist, the first image that came to my mind was Leonardo DiCaprio hanging on to a little bit of a life raft in Titanic and then freezing to death. Because at the moment, hanging on to academia is not the way to go. And I think it's interesting that at the same time, there have been attacks and funding cuts to the arts. There's absolutely been attacks on humanity at the same time. In terms of it depends. I mean, people often ask me, the question of, was it worth doing a PhD as a writer? And that's a really complex question, because it depends whether you also genuinely want to work through the theoretical exegesis type that goes with writing. So for some people, yes and no. Yes, for me, because it gave me 3 years to write, and that is a completely unique thing. But I don't think the answer would be every artist needs to be in academia. That's the way they'll make money. Because for some artists, that's just not what they're interested in, and it wouldn't help their art. It would be a restriction. And being an artist and being an academic are two different things. They're two different skill sets. Teaching a class is different than writing a story. So for some of us, it's excellent because we get to think about literature and then write about it at night. That's fantastic. But no, that can't be the answer. It's just, well, every artist can work in academia. A, because academia is also a ship that's going down. But B, because that's not the way it works for everyone.
Over to Emmett now for a question.
That's a fantastic paper. Great to see research on Wayne and Julie, who I think are two of my favorite Australian writers writing right now, and I'm glad to see research on their works. I think they're fantastically interesting, and that's just very exciting. I was actually at the launch of Wayne's Caravan Story in Melbourne, and I don't know if you know about that, but he wrote a script. So at the launch, they brought the launcher out, who was meant to be the assistant to the Minister for Arts in Victoria, who gave this satirical speech. It was actually Wayne's daughter acting in the role, and he'd written the script, but it was hilarious. You could probably try and get in contact with him and get a hold of the script, because it might be an interesting context for that, for the work you're doing as well. A question that I guess I have, which is maybe is a slightly unfair one to launch on you, because this is very much a textual paper, but it's the thing I think I'm interested in, which is that I feel like there's been a resurgence of literariness in Australia. Like, there are lots of writers who see themselves as very literary, who present themselves as very literary. There's more short story collections are being published now than were 15 years ago. I've tracked the data on that. There seem to be a lot of more experimental novels around. I'm thinking of like Ryan O'Neill's book about Australian literature that's kind of an extended in-joke. And I guess I wonder, on the one hand, it's great to see people wanting to reassert autonomy, but I also wonder if it's a kind of a defensive position, or if it's a kind of defeatist position. It's like, well, everything's against us, so we're retreating back to this kind of idea of autonomy that we have, because it's the only thing we have left. So I guess I just wonder if that's operating or not, or am I being unfair? I don't have an answer. It's a question I'm kind of wrestling with.
I mean, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a very complex question. I mean, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. The problem is that you never find out how well these books have actually done, right? Like, I mean, I know that in my circle, everyone loved Ryan O'Neill's book. Absolutely one of my favorite books. And did it win the Miles Raglan, or did it? Yeah, right. So that's
I think it won the Premier.
It won the Prime Minister's Award for Fiction. Yeah.
So that's obviously that's successful, but has it actually sold books? I mean, that helped sell books. Before that, did it sell books? So you kind of never really know. Like, I mean, from my perspective, you hear people in my circle who are also very literary saying, look at these wonderful literary books. I guess they must be doing well enough to keep getting published, but whether there's a resurgence in that actually getting out to the public, I don't really know. In terms of being a defensive mechanism, I don't know. I mean, I think arts having a defensive mechanism is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. I mean, you think of arts history, so many of the great movements were like, we are the so-and-sos and we don't do this so-and-so thing, and they produce great art, right? So sometimes it is actually nice to have something at your back saying, I'm all about this, and that's going to go into the art I produce. Again, that's not for every artist. Some like to just kind of have lots of different ideas, but I wouldn't be against people saying, well, let's just give up. We're not going to sell books. Let's do really cool literary stuff. That might produce good work. but I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Thanks so much. That's great.
Beth says that maybe her question has overlapped with the previous one, but I'm going to let you expand or go in a different direction.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. There is a little bit of an extra element to it. I really liked your paper, Alex, and I love that use of how to justify the arts. But I too noticed a sort of a defensiveness. You know, short stories are a genre. Can everyone hear me okay? My internet's unstable. Yeah. Short stories are not the most high-selling genre in Australia, even when they win prizes. And these are quite literary collections that are really standing up for literariness. But I know there are other, I guess, art-led modes of justifying the arts. And when we look at broader debates, say, about the value of books in Australia, it's much more about telling Australian stories or seeing Australian stories in print. And I wonder if you've seen any connections, I guess, between this focused literary form of standing up for the arts and these broader debates.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that, I mean, I haven't seen a huge literary reaction. I'm literally at this point working off of 2 books that I felt like fit. This is the very start of the project, which is why I'm desperate for people to send me recommendations that they think also fit. And I think these 2 particular works are easy to connect to the issues because they're both satirical, and satirical is a vein of art that kind of has that slightly instrumental feel of let's get something done through this art. But I don't think I'm not against justifying the arts through various ways. Okay, so they really do. I mean, the arts do make a genuine economic impact, and that should be said. There just needs to be balance, and we need to make sure that we don't forget the central importance of art, which is it's nice to experience. It makes us feel human when we experience it. And sometimes that's so much harder to say to the government, almost impossible to say to the government, than all these other things. But as my colleagues at Flinders, and particularly Tully Barnett, keep telling me, this is not a problem of artists can't find the way to describe the value of arts and culture. They've done it in myriad ways. They've done it in economic, they've done it through intrinsic, they've done it through health, education. It's a reception problem. So the people at the top, basically, if they like the thing, if they like the opera house, they'll put money into it. If they don't, you're in trouble. So I'm for all various ways of justifying the arts. I'm for all ways of, justify the literariness, the intellectual capacity, justify health programs that help, at-risk teenagers. All of these are good, but I think it's more of a reception problem than what we're saying.
Yeah, building the market has always been a key part of, has recently been a key part of cultural policy, not just funding production. Natalie, yeah. I can see your hands up.
Sorry, while I struggle to unmute myself. That was a great paper, Alex. I really loved it, and I'm a huge fan of Co's work, and so being introduced to Macaulay is also great for me. Thank you for that. I wondered, and it probably builds on Emmett's question a little bit, what place you think literary prize culture has played in the valuing or devaluing of the arts from a kind of policy perspective, but also I think from a kind of literariness perspective, because I think the Stella Prize has been around since about 2011, which made 2 very substantial national prizes for authors over 35, so who weren't able to be captured in the Vogel. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I have heard criticism against literary prizes, and I'm sure there are problems with them, but if you take the long view, they are mechanisms that pump money into the arts in some way. Maybe that's not the way we like, but I think they're useful. And personally, as an artist, I actually quite like having that prize on the horizon. It can be an impetus to do something. I've also been on the other side. I've judged short story competitions, and I've seen how subjective it is. It is the stories that you like the most, and the stories that win the awards. We need to remember they are not the best books. They are the ones that the people that were in charge of deciding which books they like the most. As long as everyone is okay with that, we understand it. I would say more prizes, the better. I don't think that is the perfect way to fund the arts. You don't want to rely on prizes saying, well, we don't need to do any, sort of on the ground funding because there's a great $60,000 prize that one writer wins a year. That's not going to be the answer. but they are themselves great, and they are a way of focusing attention on a particular book that probably is of merit. And it can be so difficult as a reader, right? There are so many books that come out. Which one do you do? Sometimes it's nice to say, well, I'm going to try and read this prize-winning one. It can focus our attention. So in general, I'm okay with prizes, but we don't want to rely on them as the only crutch that props an industry up.
Are there any other questions or comments people want to make? If you could raise your hand. We've got a minute or two left. Alex, a thought came to me that prior to the COVID pandemic, often the discussion was between mainstream arts companies that were still relatively well funded under the coalition government, and fringe arts funding, or smaller scale arts funding, which got decimated. And then on the news last night, I saw even the producers of mainstream commercial theatre like the Harry Potter play in Melbourne or the Frozen musical, which could hardly be called edgy. And even those companies were saying, without some subsidy, we're going bankrupt. And musicians like Ben Lee, who again has been commercially fairly successful, were buying in and saying programming for the next few years will have to be entirely scuppered because we can't get through this fifth lockdown in Melbourne. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on how COVID has really transformed the arts policy landscape.
Well, I mean, it's devastated the arts sector. Has it transformed the policy landscape? There hasn't really been any policy. It's kind of answer. It's interesting. Before this project, I was hired by UniSA just to do some research assistant work, kind of the grunt work of going through a whole bunch of different countries and looking at the timelines of when they went into lockdown and what they did for the arts. So I did the UK, didn't do the US, but did the UK, Germany, France, and New Zealand. And it was pretty depressing. Obviously, all sectors everywhere have been affected by COVID, and the greatest policy in the world is not going to make people be able to go back into a theatre when COVID's still around. But these countries were so much quicker on their feet, and they were focused on the grassroots, which goes back to your question of the top versus the bottom. A country like Germany, for example, already has in its database, they know how many freelance practicing artists there are in their country. And when COVID hit, they knew straight away that those freelance artists, who are the grassroots of this whole industry, were going to suffer. So they just sent them payments like that. They were ready. Whereas in Australia, we don't even really know, we don't even have a solid grasp on how many freelancers there are, which you could see through the fact that our policy was, if you've been in a one place of employment for 1 year, you can get some funding. Well, how many freelance artists can say that, right? So even that sort of policy was directed at, I guess, the artistic director of, a big theatre. Yeah, they're probably in the job for a year. They could probably get some funding. But even that policy again shows, the grassroots, the small organizations, they're getting absolutely nothing. So I think the policy, to answer your question in a roundabout way, the policy is just the way it's always been. It's focused on the few theatres that the politicians like to go to, and they figure the rest will just kind of sort itself out.
All right, everyone, this has been a terrific session, one of the best that I've seen at the conference, and I'm very grateful to our three speakers, Emmett and Natalie and Alexander, for good and diverse papers that nevertheless managed to strike sparks off each other. And the chat and the questions have been really lively in this session. It makes me realise what is possible in the Zoom conference format that you can't otherwise do at a conference. So please join me. It's time for virtual applause, applause icons, whatever way you want to do it, and say thank you very much for being present here, and I'll see you later on in the conference. Cheers.
And thank you, Simone, for your wonderful sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone stay safe.
You too.